Are we ready? Terrific. All right, let's start over again. Welcome to the Poison Pen and to Lisa C., who is here for all of her books, but the first one, The Flower Net. So we've been together. How long has it been?
Like 20-some years, I think. I've been coming here, which is so fantastic. Although, I will say when I first came, there may have been 3 people in the audience. So this is really wonderful.
You know, I absolutely love the Red Princess mysteries, and as you know, the third one, the one, if you, those of you who read it, takes place a lot of it on the river and has that wonderful scepter kind of thing, which, did any of you see the Dragon Robe exhibit at the Phoenix Art Museum years ago when it was here? Because they had one, and I think I photographed it and sent it to Lisa. It looks like a mushroom with a really long tail, right?
That's because it's designed from a mushroom with a really long tail. So.
Well, how about that? Right. Anyway, I keep hoping she's going to write a 4th mystery, but Snowflower and the Secret Fan took off in a whole direction and became such a bestseller that it probably is not practical for you to write another Red Princess mystery, but I live in hope. Is there any hope?
But you know, this almost could have been a mystery, I think.
True.
There was one moment, I don't know how we're starting, but I will just say that I already had the idea for the book in the sense that there's a mother who gives birth to a baby high in the tea mountains of China and has to abandon that baby, and who is then adopted by a family here. So that'll be good for everybody to know that basic part of the plot. And how I came to that's another story, but I sort of had this idea, but I was thinking, well, what's the historic backdrop? I write now historical novels, and I was giving a talk at this big library event, and it was huge, and they had brought in someone to be kind of the opening act, and he was pouring this particular kind of Chinese tea that you're going to have a little taste of now, called pu'er, and he was talking about this tea and how it grows in trees and not in shrubs, and how it has, become so valuable over time, and the history of the tea horse road, and how people used to carry this in 150-pound packs, from Yunnan, 1,000 miles to Tibet, overland through the rain and heat and humidity, and how it changed and its nature changed. And anyway, he finally comes to this point where he says, and just this year, which is now 3 years ago, there was one single cake of this tea, a little under a pound, that sold for $150,000 US. And I thought, aha, I have my historic backdrop. But even when I thought that, I thought, well, you could do anything now. I could have a murder mystery, I could have a conspiracy, I could have, something very international crime, but I did come back to the story that I wanted to originally tell.
Well, it is a crime to charge that much money for tea.
And that's not what you're drinking, by the way.
No. Sorry. Actually, this reminds me, my husband and I travel all the time, and we were in Munich some years ago, and we went into a very high-end department store, sort of like Harrods, where they have food halls in London and all that, or Macy's in New York back in the day, or whatever. And they had these signs all over about the white tea, the spring white tea is, or maybe fall, has just come in. So I felt, it was too early for beer. So I said to my husband, it sounds absolutely wonderful, let's order the tea. Now, we're fairly insouciant as travelers, so we just sat down and we ordered the tea, and indeed it arrived, and it was indeed wonderful. And then they brought the check. And Rob said to me, what were we drinking? It was $50, and that's when I sort of caught on that it wasn't all Lipton or even Twining,
Right.
There's a lot. The tea world is really like the wine world or other, even high-end coffee worlds.
Yeah, it's very much like the wine world. They use the same language to talk about it in tea tastings, that, you start with the lightest one, the least valuable one, and you work your way up. And there was one tea tasting that I went to very early on, just at someone's house, just 3 of us, and we're working our way up, and the last cup was just a little tiny cup, about 2 ounces, where the liquid alone was worth $1,000. The nice thing about a tea tasting as opposed to a wine tasting is you can actually drive home afterwards.
And you're pretty buzzed, but not from the alcohol, from the caffeine.
Actually, this tea doesn't have very much caffeine. If it's a good quality, it will not have much caffeine to it. But the more valuable, the more sophisticated the tea, the older it is. Unlike, I'm going to tell you some bad news. If you have any tea in your house that's over 6 months old, it isn't good anymore, so you should just throw it out. But this, unlike every other tea in the world, grows in value with age. And so it is like wine in that sense, that you can buy one that's 10 years, 20 years, 30, 50 years old, and it's gone up in value. You could buy it and store it in your basement, and it will go up in value over time.
I didn't realize that. I do know, and this may come as a surprise to you, that if you dilute your tea with milk and so forth, all the good qualities in the tea just went south. So, I mean, to really get the benefit of tea, you need to drink it straight, so to speak, or black, which makes it fascinating. It also, you're huge, like wine area, tea depends so much on altitude and soil, it grows on bushes, and so it's really difficult to even mechanize the plucking, isn't it?
That's right. All tea is done by hand, and actually, all of those tea shrubs, whether you've seen them in person or you've seen them in photos, sometimes they go up those tea terraces. No matter where you go in the world, if you see a shrub like that, it's been manicured and cultivated and cloned into that shape. So every single shrub like that is a clone, and they're built that way or designed that way so that you can just walk along the tops and carefully pick the buds as they're opening. It's this, this little 3-leaf thing just as it starts to open in the sun. But where this book takes place, it's in Yunnan province where they have the original old tea trees. So these are trees that are 200, 800, 1,000 years old. There's one tree 3,500 years old that they know was cultivated for tea.
That's really amazing. And we had an author here in March named Randy Wayne White who wrote a book last year. There's a terrible citrus blight afoot. I can't remember what it's called, but it's killing off the citrus trees in this country, and particularly in Florida. And I had told him about, all of you know about the phylloxera epidemic that was wiping out the vineyards in France. And the solution to that was they came over here and took rootstock that had been brought to Napa Valley from France, and that was phylloxera-free, and took it back and replanted it. And so it basically saved the French wine industry. Anyway, the premise of Randy took from that was that there must be somewhere an ancient citrus tree in Florida that the Spaniards brought over. It would be like 500 years old. And if it's a feral tree growing out in the middle of the Everglades, then since they came from Asia, they probably are resistant to this terrible citrus disease that has come here from Asia. And so he's found it. He's actually done that. I mean, it started as an idea for a book, but now he's actually gone into the Everglades and found the 500-year-old orange tree that may save the Florida citrus industry. So I'm not at all surprised that they're truly ancient tea trees. Yeah. Right. So why don't you tell us more about the book, because you've been traveling around talking about it, and I'll just look here interested.
Well, this is a nice big cup of tea. So this book actually starts with a line that's very popular saying in the Aka ethnic minority: no coincidence, no story. And I would say that for me, this book would not have happened if there hadn't been a series of coincidences, or you could even say maybe fate, that sort of set me on this path. And the first one of those was I was just walking down the street going to the movies with my husband, and we saw up ahead of us an older white couple with their adopted teenage daughter Chinese daughter walking between them. And she had her hair up in a ponytail, and it was swishing back and forth, and I had this vision of her as kind of being like a fox spirit in that family. And in Chinese tradition, fox spirits, they can be kind of naughty, they can be pretty mischievous, they're always doing things like, sneaking into a scholar's study late at night, poor guy, he's studying hard, and then she has sex with him. So that, they're, like I said, naughty and mischievous. But in their best moments, they can bring great love, and they have this ability to create families. And so when I saw this girl walking with her fox tail just swishing back and forth like that, I thought, well, yes, she is like a fox spirit in that family, in the sense that she had brought these two people together and had helped to create a family. Her presence had helped to create this family. And so I had been thinking about writing about the one-child policy and also transnational adoption probably for 25 years. But now all of a sudden this was the moment. It just hit me in such a strong way. And so I started doing research, and then a couple of months later I was doing this tea event that I was just mentioning, a book event where they had this tea master come, and he was the opening act, and if you've ever seen a Japanese tea ceremony, it's very formal, very stylized, very elegant, but not with Chinese tea. That water is sloshing all around, and the tea is pouring all around, and it's very, very messy. And so the table itself has these little holes in it, so all that sloshing tea can go down through the table, through a not very cute plastic tube, and into a bucket. And again, he was talking about all of these different kinds of tea, and we were tasting the pu'er, and when he said that about the $150,000, I just knew this was it. So I started doing research on that. Now, about a month later, my husband was at a board meeting, and someone came up to him and said, "So, what's Lisa working on?" And my husband, dear one that he is, was like, "I don't know, it's something about tea." And they were like, he said, well, is it pu'er? And my husband was, I don't know, it's something about tea. So the next day, this man wrote to me and said, "Are you writing about pu'er?" And it turned out that just the week before, he had been in a big Chinese banquet where he was seated next to a woman who is the largest importer of pu'er tea into the United States. And did I want to meet her? So off I went. Now, that woman didn't speak any English, and so we met at a whole other woman's house, Linda. That's where this tea comes from. She has her own tea, pu'er tea company. And we sat there and we drank all of these teas. And at that point, I'd already planned a trip to Yunnan and to go during tea picking season. And we drank all these teas, including that one that was, $2,000 for just a little bit of liquid. And on my, before I left, I just asked Linda, "Look, I'm going to Yunnan for tea picking season. Is there anyone you think I should interview? Any place you think I should go?" And she said, "Well, I'm going to Yunnan for tea picking season. Why don't you just travel with me?" And so off we went.
It was really a lucky book, wasn't it?
It really was.
It really was.
I mean, it really was. And that's not even all of it. The one more.
Okay.
One more.
Sure.
Thing. So, Yunnan is pretty interesting. It's a global biodiversity hotspot.
Where is it, for those who don't know?
So it's in, oh God, my brain. Don't ask me trick questions. It's in the far west of China. Far, far west of China. I had to look at a map in my head. And it's pretty small. It's only about 4% of the overall landmass of China, but it's also up against part of it is up against the Himalayan mountains. And so, just as a total side note, they got to rename one of their cities Shangri-La because it is one of the places in the world that they think could have been Shangri-La. So,
were there a Shangri-La?
If there really were a Shangri-La, this might be one of about 3 places that they think was.
It definitely is up against the mountains, which is important for the tea because it grows best at elevation.
Right. And so, so it's a global biodiversity hotspot, and that means a couple things. They have more plant life in this one province of China than all together in the rest of the northern hemisphere. They have more species of animals in this one small province of China than in all together in the rest of China. And then that biodiversity also applies to human beings. So China has 55 ethnic minorities, in addition to the Han majority, who make up like 95% of the population. Of those 55, 26 of them live in Yunnan. And so when I went, I was thinking, well, I for Snowflower and the Secret Fan, if some of you have read that, I wrote about the Yao ethnic minority. So I knew I would be writing about an ethnic minority, and I'd kind of narrowed it down to about 5, I think. And so, this is a really remote area. You might think of China as like a global global economic superpower, and of course it is. But if you get far enough out into the countryside, it's like you're stepping back in time, 100 or more years. And so this area, we were driving, everything was dirt roads, up these single-lane dirt roads, high up into the mountains, with the big cliff hanging down off the side. And we'd see, people picking tea up in the trees, and we'd stop and climb up there and talk to them. And China, especially in the countryside, they don't have the tradition of knocking on the door. You just walk in, and so we'd be driving along, see a little house, walk in, and they'd be feeding the baby or chopping vegetables or whatever, and we would just talk, and then pretty soon we'd be drinking tea, and then pretty soon they'd say, hey, do you want to stay for lunch? And then the next thing they'd crack a chicken's neck right by my ear, and the feathers would be going. Anyway, there came this day where we went to visit an Aka ethnic minority tea-picking family. They were a very well-known family on this one part of the mountain. And Linda and Elaine had been going there for years, and their tea is just, very well-known and superb. Anyway, their daughter, Abu, is about 30 years old. And she reminded me a lot of myself in the sense that she loved to ask questions. She loved to collect stories. So she was telling stories about her mother and her grandmother, the elders in her village, people on her side of the mountain. Even her own personal story was, so important, I think, as I heard it, that it actually became filled in a lot of the details of what happens to Lian. Anyway, by the time she said, do you want to stay for lunch, and they killed another chicken, I knew that I'd be writing about the Aka.
Which is an amazing tribe. Now, I haven't been to this part of China, but I have been to Burma and to Vietnam. And if you are up in the mountain areas there, similarly, there are lots of small minorities and so forth. And I will tell you, in case this whole tea thing really interests you, that a couple of years ago, our absolutely best-selling paperback, maybe our best-selling paperback of all time, is a book called Tea Time for the Firefly. And it takes place in Assam. And it really is a brilliant book, I think. I read it while I was in Burma. Actually, we were tied to a tree because the Irrawaddy River is so shallow that the boats get hung up, and then you have to sit there tied to a tree while they go for rescue boats to float you back off. And it turned out the author lived in Fountain Hills, which was the biggest surprise of the entire thing. I was going, seriously? But anyway, Assam has a tea culture very different from what you were talking about. And many of the workers in Assam actually come from Burma, because it's all that high mountain country. And they, kind of went back and forth without paying attention to boundaries, sort of like, Indians in Montana would go across to Canada. Nobody really cared. And so it's interesting to read your book and contrast, because the Scots came to Assam and largely created tea plantations because Britain took up tea tremendously. And so they were there harvesting and, exploiting in the whole 9 yards in Assam to take it back to Great Britain. There were a lot of parallels. One of my questions was, did the British do that in Yunnan, or was it just too remote?
Actually...
Or were they just focused on opium and didn't care?
Well, actually, the British tried really hard to steal tea out of China, and they did succeed. But it used to, for the Chinese government, this is, back more than a couple of hundred years ago, if you took a seedling or a seed or a plant out of China, that was a death sentence. And so the British worked really hard to steal it, and they managed to do that, and then that's when they started planting in India mostly.
Well, they'd been practicing on rubber trees up the Amazon, so the British, that's what they did. They took everything back to Kew Garden, and they grew it, and then they sent it out. That's why Malaysia has rubber trees. They're not indigenous to Malaysia, but the British stole the rubber tree from the Amazon, from Manaus, and took it back to Kew Garden, and then off they went. Really interesting, wasn't it? Yeah. Well, anyway, let's talk about the story, because that's the background, but what actually happens is really very moving.
So maybe I'll just start. Should I just start at the beginning? So there's the book opens with this little girl, 7 years old, Leon, who wakes up, long before dawn, and she and her family have a very simple breakfast of just a soup of hot water and weeds, and then they set out, still long before dawn, walking up the mountain about 2 hours until they go out into their groves and pick tea. And at the end of the day, they walk along the crest of the mountain to the tea collection center where they need to sell their leaves. And it's at this tea collection center that Leon meets a little boy and gets in trouble with a little boy named Sanpa. And the two sets of parents are, come together, and they try to decide, should these children have a healing ceremony together or should they be separated? And everything depends on what day of the week they were born. And I should just say that the Aka, they have their own traditions, their own culture, their own origin myth. They celebrate their own New Year. They follow a 12-day week. The women wear these very elaborate headdresses that they work on, certainly in preparation for marriage, but add on to them throughout their lifetimes that weigh as much as 20 pounds, and they have, silver and coins and bones and feathers and beetle wings, and I don't know where they get these, but little fluffy pom-poms, they're very elaborate and beautiful.
Like Hello Kitty, or?
Yeah, well, they're just, it's just this very funny kind of combination, but really represents each woman. Anyway, the two kids are brought together, and the parents have to decide, should they do this healing ceremony together or apart? And it all depends on what day of the week they were born, and Leon was born on Pig Day, and Sanpa was born on Tiger Day, and the world knows tigers like to eat pigs. And so this ceremony has to be separated. But not only that, they're told they can never see each other again. Well, of course, it wouldn't be a novel if they didn't see each other again, and so she does end up pregnant and gives birth to this baby. And she has to abandon it down, and it's the first time she comes down off the mountain and actually goes into what we might think of as civilization. And that gets you to about page 75. And she then, I would say, if tea is sort of a metaphor, she rides this wave of what happens to this particular tea as it leaves the mountain, goes into China, and then around the world. But meanwhile, there's the baby, Haley, who's been adopted here. And, a baby can't speak for herself. And so I have other people speaking for her. So at the beginning, there's a report from the woman who runs the orphanage. She arrives here quite ill, and so there are letters from the specialists who've taken care of her. Emails between her adoptive mother and her grandmother, until pretty soon you start to hear Haley in her own voice, whether it's just her second grade spelling words and spelling sentences for homework. I will just tell you straight up that I stole those from my kids. Until you get, and they're just different things, until you get to a chapter. It's not her last chapter, but it may be my favorite chapter. That is the transcript of a group therapy session for girls who've been adopted from China. And so this goes back to what we talked about at the very, very beginning, which was this kind of thought and obsession I've had. I don't know if obsession is the right word, but interest that I've had in these young women who've been adopted from China for, just a long, long time. And I think for me, a lot of it has to do with issues of identity. That for many of them, they've grown up in families where they are the only Chinese face, perhaps in communities, the only Chinese face in their school, in their church, in their synagogue. And, I've had that same experience myself. I lived with my mother when I was growing up, but I spent a lot of time with my father's side of the family. And my father's side of the family is Chinese. It's my great-grandfather had 4 wives, one of whom was Caucasian. That's the family I'm descended from. And so today in Los Angeles, I have about 400 relatives. There are about a dozen that look like me, the majority full Chinese, and then this little spectrum in between. And so, how is it we identify ourselves? We identify ourselves by the people who are around us. They're the ones who tell us who we are. And so when I was a kid, what I saw around me were Chinese faces. What I experienced was Chinese culture, tradition, food. And so this is the reason why I write the kinds of books I do. But it also gave me this kind of, it's given me this kind of empathy, I think, for these young women who've grown up in families where they don't look like everybody around them either. And so how can I say that? I'm an obsessive researcher. I mean, it is my favorite part. I love it. And so I really wanted to find young women all around the country who'd been adopted from China, not little girls, but sort of 18 to 22 years old. And some of them I met at book signings. They'd be coming through a line and you'd be, who's this for? And tell me about yourself or whatever. And then they'd volunteer that they'd been adopted. And I'd say, can I send you some questions? And I had a list of about 12 questions that went out around the country. And what I got back were these letters, 30 to 50 pages long. And these young women just completely opened their hearts and shared their stories with me. And so, it's not just this kind of issue of identity, but they have had other struggles, and enough so that they have their own label, which is the grateful but angry adoptee. And over time, and of course, now this is not 100% across the board, but it doesn't mean every single one, but enough that they have their own label. And I came to look at it, though, a little differently, that it's less that it's grateful but angry, rather it's grateful but sad. And this was summed up for me by this one young woman who wrote to me that, she said, I know I'm the most precious person in my family. And of course, they would, right? Because their parents went through so much before they even decided to go to China to adopt. They're typically, not always, pretty well-to-do families. These kids have great educations, wonderful opportunities. They live in America, for heaven's sakes, so they know that they're lucky. Anyway, she said, I know I'm the most precious person in my family, but I wasn't precious enough for my birth parents to keep me as their one child. And I thought that is such a, it's both a burden and a void that they carry.
But generally, if they had to choose, they kept the boy, right? So there were surplus girls, and that policy is apparently changing in China. But there's a really wonderful author, Ridley Pearson. Some of you may have met him here at the store. And Ridley and his wife adopted a little girl from China. They went to China and adopted her, brought her back. They call her Story, which I think is a lovely name. And then Ridley took up I'm trying to remember what it was, but anyway, he was able to go and live in Shanghai with his children and his wife. So the Story could be they were the odd men out. And he said it was, it really changed his, not changed, it was illuminating, because then 3 of them looked different, and Story looked like everybody else, whereas in St. Louis, they look like everybody. Story is different. And I thought that was a really nice thing for him to do, to go to Shanghai and live and write. Have you talked to Ridley?
I met him once in Shanghai, but we were just...
Oh, you met in Shanghai?
Yeah, we were just at a dinner together at that big writers' conference or I don't know, it was just a dinner, I guess. It wasn't even the big writers' conference, but it was just that one night, and we didn't talk about that.
Right. Well, I've known him forever and been through the entire story of, the adoption and all, and identifying and trying. Some of the parents have tried to deal with those issues, as he has, by going over. I don't want to make you cry, but did losing your mother have some effect on you in regard to how you wrote this book? Because that was really hard.
Yeah, I've written about mothers and daughters a lot. And I've written about this concept or this idea of mother love a lot, which is a Chinese written character that combines these two elements of love and pain. And this book really is just filled with mothers. There's and daughters, but there's Leon and her mother, Leon and the baby she's given birth to, that baby and her adoptive mother, the adoptive mother and her mother, two other Aka mothers who are just completely critical to the plot, but in two different ways. So really just populated with these mothers. And 12 days before the final edits were due, my mom was diagnosed with cancer, and she died 10 days later. And I don't, it's so weird when you're writing I'm sure you hear this a lot from other writers, but the heart and mind sort of work in these mysterious ways. And I think in this kind of creative way where you're picking up things that you're not really even fully aware of. And I didn't even realize it in the moment, but even though you think you're done, like the final edits, that doesn't really mean final edits. You still have copy editing and page proofs and, many more drafts. And it was really quite, I'd say maybe 3 or 4 months later that I just saw, now I know what this book is about. But it was really pretty hard.
It would be different for you because your mom was a writer. I mean, that obviously shaped who you are. The fact that you grew up with a mother who was a remarkable writer.
Yeah.
So there was loss and loss. I mean, there's the ordinary loss, but then there's a different loss too.
I actually. This is maybe more than you want to know about me, but I really held it together, after she died, and we had the memorial, and, you do all of the things you're supposed to do. I'm not saying I wasn't sad. Of course I was sad, but as this book came closer to coming out, I just really was having a very hard time. And I know many of you get those invitations from me. While writing those envelopes out, this is something that my mom and I have been doing for, when she was just writing books, it was much smaller, but before I started writing. So I'm going to say something like 40 years we've written on envelopes together. And on not the first event, but there's a store in Los Angeles called Diesel. And before that, there was a store called Dutton's. And so, but that's closed. And so the big event on my side of town was at Diesel. And I was like, I didn't want to go. And it was going to be really hard. And I knew it was going to be, and it was really hard because probably half the audience were her friends and who'd come to support me. But the next morning I woke up and I was like, I know why this was so hard. If I counted up, I did right then, all of the book events from all of my mother's books in hardcover and paperback, all of the books for the man that she lived with for 30 years in hardcover and paperback, all of the books that the three of us wrote together in hardcover and paperback, all of my books in hardcover and paperback, this would have been the 63rd book event at that one store. And so this was, no wonder it was so hard for me.
Well, it was starting out on a journey all by yourself at that point, which is hard. Lisa and I emailed when her mom died a lot, and I remember how sad it was for you. But I also think maybe it was really helpful.
Yeah,
sometimes mourning, we don't do mourning as a public event anymore like the Victorians, where everybody you could tell because people dressed in mourning, and it was like, codes went out and you could see a person and know that they'd had a loss and so forth. But we don't do any of that now. So I hope, I thought after you started out and we were through emailing that maybe it would be a helpful thing for you.
Yeah. It's just...
Especially so she died so fast. You're never prepared.
No, you're never prepared, but that
was... For a sudden loss.
Yeah. Harder. Although she'd been ill, she had been ill off and on with different things, but it was just such a shock, and I my mom was a writer, and she also was a book critic for the Washington Post for 25 years. So reviewing a book a week for 25 years, and before that for the LA Times. And she had fallen and broken her hip and something. And so I read almost the entire book to her in manuscript. And the thing is, she was sick and she was on drugs, but I'd be reading and she'd say, wait a minute. Now, back there about 5 minutes ago, you said, something, whatever it would be. And she said, I don't think that makes sense. And actually, there was a sentence. I wish I could remember it, which was all along like my favorite sentence in the book. And she was just, Lisa, you really don't need that. You're just showing off that you're a writer. So just take it out. And so, I did. But that, we had read each other's work all of these years. And so to be able to do that one more time was really pretty great.
So not only have you started out now without your mom, but you've also gone to a new publisher. So has that been a different experience for you too? It's always a change,
Yeah.
I mean, to switch gears.
Yes, so I had been at Random House since Dragon Bones. So that's a lot of, that's Dragon Bones, Snowflower, Peony in Love, Shanghai Girls, Dreams of Joy, China Dolls. And I had a wonderful editor, Bob Loomis, who was William Styron's editor and Maya Angelou's editor, and I was one of the last people he edited. And he had the very bad form to retire when he was 85. And so it just wasn't the same, and then it was a very hard thing to leave, but also it felt like the right time. And I will, as I wrote in an email to my editor at Random House, we're going to be in bed together forever. They own every single thing I've ever written except for this. So, it's not, we're not divorced.
Really a divorce,
yeah,
right.
We're just...
It's a branching out.
Yeah.
I mention it because I think the cover of this book is so beautiful, and all publishers have different art people and different design ideas and so forth. Scribner is a more literary house. They do commercial. They publish Stephen King.
Yeah, I was just
so
gonna say.
It's not like they aren't commercial, but they've always had a tradition of being, a really literary house. They're now a part of Simon & Schuster, but they were independent for a long time. And for those of you who maybe used to go to New York on a basis, they had one of the most beautiful bookstores ever. It really, any of you been to the Scribner bookstore? Oh my God, it was just beautiful. And now I don't even know what it's probably part of Trump. But it had a balcony and all. It was a fabulous place to go. But I think that the design, that they put into your book is really
beautiful.
It is. Did you notice that the cover kind of shimmers if you I'm here to tell you as a publisher, an incredibly expensive thing to do. If you put gilding on a book cover, it's a lot of bucks.
And I love how it's layered, and she's behind there, and you can see just a little bit of her headdress and earrings, so.
And her eye.
And her eye.
Right, which is lovely. Well, anything else you want to say, or would you like to take questions from the audience?
How about some questions? Okay. Did I really write on the corner? If I look at your envelope, I will be able to tell you. But it is, I had about 5 people helping me. I can guarantee you that at some point I touched your envelope. I brought, but it's now about 20,000. And so that would be a lot of envelopes for just me to write on. And it takes about a month. Actually, this time it took about 5 weeks. And we have a lot of fun. We sit there together. See, now let me look at your envelope, and I can tell you. Yes, I wrote on this one. So see, somebody showed me one last night in Scottsdale. Here was the thing, not Scottsdale, Salt Lake City. At the beginning, Arizona was also Tucson. They were both on. So that was actually my very first event was in Tucson. So I think I was the one who just sat on the couch and just wrote on everything for Arizona. So, but I'll tell you that by the end, we were so wiped out and tired that it was like, I just brought out all of these colored pens, really, and then just wrote, the tea girl is coming, and then all these just squiggles, and then there was one person who was a pretty nice artist, and she was like making a teacup on a table with like flowers. I mean, you can only have one color of pen, and got to move it along here. But we have a lot of fun doing it. I mean, it feels like sort of like a quilting bee, and I provide lunch. So if you ever want to come, next time the book is coming out, you want to come and help, we could use it.
So now you all know that you should save your envelope for forensic analysis.
Yeah.
Next time, see if there's any of Lisa's actual DNA on the envelope.
There was a woman I was in Santa Cruz, she came and she had 10 of them. It was like the craziest thing. She had one for every book, and she brought them all.
She saved them.
She saved them, and she showed them all to me. I was like, dang, you gotta, get rid of some stuff.
Well, yes. All right. Another question. We silenced you? Come on, guys. I'm going to repeat that for the camera. She's thanking Lisa for her support of libraries and doing Skype. Lisa really does very extensive appearances for all of your books, especially since Snowflower, when you were a bit more in demand. But
yeah, I know because I just had the email today, sort of, what is it? Confirming all the details. I'm doing an event in Newport Beach in a couple of weeks for their library, but it's to raise money for their literacy campaign. So what a wonderful thing that a writer can participate in that. And of course, writers should participate in anything that supports independent bookstores and libraries and schools. And I do visit a lot of places just on Skype. I also visit a lot of book clubs on Skype. My friend Linda, who did this tea, has made up a how to have your own tea tasting book club that only has pu'er tea in it, and that you can go.
That's very true. And she was nice enough to email us and say, if you'd like to have pu'er tea, because we hadn't really thought about it, but.
Actually, I think you guys had, and that's what actually triggered the whole idea.
Oh, okay. All
Somebody
right.
from, I think it was Jeffrey, actually wrote to the publisher, and then that was that just triggered a whole idea.
Because I said it would be nice to have the tea if we could figure it out. We have expanded the store. We've taken over the whole building. So while we're not changing the front of the store, 70% of our customers don't live here. We are a global. No, I'm serious. We are a global bookstore. So while Lisa's signing books for you, she signed way more books that are going out the back. So we've taken over the whole rest of the building, and we've included a kitchen with, yay, a dishwasher at last. I am so tired of taking home all the cups and doing the laundry and the whole bit. So we're going to be able to do more of that. But Jeffrey has bought an actual urn, I think, now. Do we not have our own? Look how big time we're getting. We have actual urns and cups and dishwasher. And my daughter, who got married last May, was able to buy her champagne flutes at IKEA for, I think, $1 a piece. And she decided it would be more efficient just to give them to us than to wash them. So we have like 100 flutes now for it. So, you just never know how it's going. But you know what? I think
next time I'll have to write a book that has champagne in it. And then
that's a really good idea.
And then we'll all have champagne at the next one.
We could do that. Yes, ma'am. Did you have a question?
Oh, so this is a great question. How do I get around the language barrier? Now, one thing to remember is that in China now they have more English speakers than in all of North America. Okay, but when you're way out in the countryside, and then these people speak Aka. They don't speak Mandarin, they don't speak Cantonese. And so I was traveling with my friend Linda, who's fluent. I mean, she was she was born in Hong Kong, but her family's Mandarin speaking, so she's fluent in both, and of course English. And so, but many of these hill people have had to learn Mandarin just so that they can deal with the rest of the country. And also, television now is all in Mandarin mostly, and will have subtitles if you can't understand it, but it allows you to read. But that's the way I usually hire someone who speaks that local dialect, but this time was a little different. It was a kind of complicated, interesting way to sort of translate really through almost 4 different languages.
On that topic, Jeffrey, do we have the Pattison book? There's a really fabulous author named Elliot Pattison who wrote a book called Skull Mantra that won the Edgar Allan Poe Award for Best Mystery years ago. He sets them in Tibet, and in fact his detective or his main character is Han Chinese who is being punished and has been sent to basically sort of a gulag in Western China, and there's evil thing, but he becomes accustomed to the Tibetans and part of the Tibetan culture, and they're absolutely fabulous books. But this is a question I was going to ask Linda. He has been nice enough to send us to give away, so we will give one away tonight. No, that's Anne Cleves. Wrong author. Try again. She's British. Shetland Islands. He asked us, because we have so faithfully supported him, he's a lawyer back in Pennsylvania and doesn't travel, if we would like to have some signed copies of his books and that we could then give them away. So this one is called Mandarin Gate, which we will give to those of you who have numbers in your books. You will be eligible to win one. But in his most recent book, Skeleton God, which I absolutely loved, the plot gets going because there are people on a hillside, and they've found what looks like it might be a grave, and suddenly from out of it comes, I think it's Danny Boy, but suddenly there's this music that starts playing from inside the grave, and they open it up, and there is the dead American, and his cell phone is with him, and it's his cell phone ringtone, because somebody is phoning him. So my question to you is, even in Yunnan, cell phones, have they gone
absolutely.
that far?
Yeah, one of the things about China is they're really technologically advanced, certainly beyond what we're doing in many ways.
Right.
So they didn't bother laying out landlines. They just skipped over it and went straight to cell phones.
And plus, if you have the mountainous thing, you've got excellent places for cell phone towers.
And so, like Abu, the woman, the Akka woman, who was so helpful to me when I was at home, and I thought, now wait a minute, how does this thing happen again? Or I'm a little confused about this. We could send her a message on WeChat, which is like it's like an instant messaging thing, which it would go there and come back, and if the time of day was right, I'd get the answer back in 2 minutes.
Fabulous. But inevitably, in response to your question, it is going to universalize language. It's going to standardize language, because people can now communicate more, and they have to find a common way to do that. So I would think everyone would in that area would have to have a second language, whether it was Mandarin or, well, it wouldn't be English. Why would it be?
Well, but here's the thing about Chinese. It doesn't, the written language is standard.
Right.
So it doesn't matter if it's Cantonese or Mandarin or the Wu dialect of Shanghai or Guangdong province, where my family's from, 1,200 known dialects. The written language is standard. Now, this doesn't apply to the ethnic minorities whose languages are completely different, but the written language is standard. And so, China is undergoing the greatest mass human migration in the history of the world as people leave the countryside and go to the cities. And when they get there, they may not speak the language. And so, again, the written language is standard. I'm going to have to just put this down. So what they do is they write on their palm with their hand, with their finger. So, I want to buy some carrots because
it's an ideogram.
Because the written language is standard.
Right. It's really fascinating. Yes, ma'am.
Well, from when I really start working and really start doing the research, I'd say it's 2 to 3 years. But when I saw that young woman walking with her parents, that may have been even a little earlier than that. I think I was still working on China dolls. So it's usually something I guess I'm a slow percolator, because I'll have something that I'm sort of thinking about for the future. Even while I'm, working on, as I was working on this, I'm already thinking about the next one. And so and even that idea is from something about 6 or 7 years ago, the one that I'm working on now. So I sort of feel like that's a good thing, because I'm living with it for a pretty long time before I commit. I guess I have big commitment issues, but that means I really know, do I really care about this? And I could be sort of poking around and doing little bits of research just for fun, just to see how much I'm interested in it. And then if if I'm obsessed, then yes, I think I'm interested in it, and there comes that moment where I think, there it is, and I know. But I just let those things kind of sit with me and see what happens, I'm patient.
So
I'm either patient or I'm very slow. Or both.
So in our various emails about hiking in Peru, I'm about to go back to Peru for the 4th time, and at my age, hike in the Cordillera. Has it occurred to you that you might want to write a book about someplace else, or do you think that China is where you are?
The next book is in South Korea. If it lasts till next month,
Well, it's not a huge move. It's not like Peru, but still.
No, but it is in Asia, and
right.
So the next, do you want to hear just like a little bit?
Sure.
So there's an island off the southern tip of South Korea called Jeju, and on this island for about it's a matrifocal society, so not a matriarchy, but focused on women. And so for about 1,000 years, the women there have been free divers, and they dive down on a single breath, down about 60 feet, stay under for 2 minutes, harvest seafood. They, have supported their families. So they're the ones who are the breadwinners, and the husbands take care of the kids, clean the house, do the laundry. And these women, it used to be that they would retire at about age 50. In the 1970s, finally, girls could have an education, and so these women saved up their money so that they could send their daughters to school, and they went off to work in tourism or become PhDs and whatnot. And so now, the youngest is maybe 55, but I interviewed a bunch of them who were in their 80s and 90s and still diving. And they say, in the 70s there were about 30,000 of them, and now there are less than 4,000. And so they think that, in a generation they're going to be gone.
Is that all like the pearl divers in Japan?
They taught the pearl divers.
In Japan. Uh-huh. Okay. Yeah, we have time for maybe, yes,
and
sir, one more
way
question.
In the back.
Oh, 2 more questions then.
Yeah. See, now that was a great idea that I had a long time ago. So the greatest pirate in the history of the world was a woman. And she had a fleet with 20,000 men. Here's the problem, though. As I did research about her, she wasn't very nice. And she was really like a pretty evil person, actually. And, there's some stories that are really great, but then you just start thinking about how can you make that person sympathetic? There really wasn't a way to make her sympathetic. I spent a lot of time, actually, on that. And even more than maybe I think more than I would now, but that was quite a few years ago. And I just... I kept thinking about it, and no matter what I did, she was not a good person, she just was not, and I just couldn't find a way to make her sympathetic, and I think that's a problem, And
we have a question.
Yeah, I'm just maybe. There was another story that I really loved, and I've done also a tremendous amount of research, where there were three women who were kidnapped from China and brought here as prostitutes in the 1920s into San Francisco, and they managed to escape. And their case was the first time that Chinese women had ever testified in court. They won. They won their freedom. They broke up this huge, triad gang. But here's the problem. What did they do for a living? I mean, it wasn't their choice, but you still have that day-to-day of how they spent their time. And so, it's like it's very hard, I think. I mean, I write about women who have a hard time. There's no question about that. If you think about these stories that I tell, these women aren't just like, oh, let's play tennis and get our nails done. I mean, they have pretty hard lives, but they also, at their core, have to be pretty sympathetic, I think, in some ways. And I think it would be hard for most readers to have great and deep and continuing sympathy for 400 pages for three prostitutes.
I think that's true. I've read books from time to time where there's no one in them to like, and then, you just don't care. We have a question from the live stream audience. What's the name of the pirate queen? She's Chinese, obviously. And do you remember what century, roughly? See Jeff afterward. Okay. Do you remember what century she was in? Modern or? 18th century? Okay, all right. I'm sure it is, right. All right, there was one more question somewhere in the back, and then we're going to need to sign books. Do you remember who it was? Okay, well then this lady apparently is going to be our...
Okay, so so how are my books received in China? And so the early ones were all pirated. And then pirating kind of really more or less fell by the wayside. And then starting with, I'm gonna say Snowflower, then they were all published until Dreams of Joy, the one you just mentioned that takes place during the Great Leap Forward. And while I didn't write anything that I thought, I was only writing things that even the Chinese government has released information that had not been released before. But that doesn't mean that anybody wants to do that with their private publishing company. If it's one thing if it's the government, it's another thing if you're just a small enterprise. And so, but this new book has been bought, and it's actually been bought by a publisher in Yunnan, where the story takes place. So that'll, I think that's pretty exciting.
That is so cool.
Yeah.
If you're interested in that, if any of you've seen the documentary, I think it's called The First Monday in May. No, you're all looking blankly. All right. I saw it, and my husband, who could not be dragged away from it, I could not believe it. It's actually a story about the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which is only closed 2 days a year, Christmas Day and the first Monday in May, which is when Anna Wintour stages their costume thing, all right? And it's absolutely fabulous because what they decided to do was to have the costume of that year all be displayed in the Chinese art galleries. And if you want to see Byzantine museum politics, the government of China, the Chinese ambassador, all of them negotiating, putting these fabulous clothes in among the Chinese art without, could they put in a Mao jacket? Would it be, detrimental to, and the Chinese art curator was like beside himself. And at the end, it is absolutely fabulous. It was the most successful or second most successful show they ever had, but getting there is amazing. As I said, I dragged my husband to see it while we were on the Crystal Northwest Passage crew, and I thought he would leave in 20 minutes. at the end, we were supposed to go do something, and he wouldn't leave. He was just riveted to the entire thing. So if you are interested in watching a negotiation with actual Chinese people about how to represent their country here, or what to do with their artistic heritage and all, you cannot do better than to watch this movie. Besides, Anna Wintour alone, who is never without a Starbucks cup in her hand, ever, is amazing. So it's great. So we've told you, Tea Time for the Firefly. Do not miss it. Patrick, who's the author? I'm going completely blank. Thank you. Shona Patel, who lives here in Fountain Hills. We probably still have copies of it. Fabulous. And also Elliot Pattison, if you're at all interested in the whole relationship between China and Tibet. This is an amazing guy. Skull Mantra is the first one. We have copies of the new one, Skeleton God, which I think is his best one. And Patrick King, what numbers are we dealing with? We're going to give away a book. 37? Okay. So if those of you who have bought Lisa's book will look, you've got a numbered ticket in it. And Lisa, I'm going to ask you to pick a number between 1 and 37.
4.
Number 4. That's you. Well, you get to win Mandarin Gate. Jeffrey, do be sure to take a photo of her and get her name, because we promised Elliot we would do that. So, ladies and gentlemen, please give Lisa a round of applause for another fabulous event. Now, here's what we're going to do, because it'll just take us a minute. If you guys would all stand up and just whip out into the parking lot for a minute, we'll get all these chairs out of the way. Lisa's going to stay here at this little table so that she doesn't have to go up and down for photos, and you can get your book signed. Thank you so much for coming.